Hi, folks. Given that I'm out of town, but that it's important we maintain our continuity, I thought it might be nice if we were able to set up a situation in which we could have a special lecture on a topic that's very central to 20th century music, which you can all view and upon which you can take notes, and after which you can then have a discussion facilitated by our TAs. So I thought what I'd do is present a lecture based in sound on the history of jazz in the first half of the long 20th century. Now, obviously, we could spend an entire semester or even an entire dissertation working on jazz as a topic and still not come to the end of this great music. Nevertheless, we should at least acknowledge the presence of jazz in the worlds of 20th century music and the ways in which jazz intersected with Western art music at various moments. Now, one such moment is the era immediately before and during the First World War in Paris, which is why this particular point in the semester is a good moment, I think, for a lecture on jazz. So I've asked the TAs to pull up a Spotify playlist. This is largely but not entirely based in the compilation, which was released along with a documentary series by Ken Burns called Jazz, The Story of America's Music. Now, while I have major issues with Burns' storytelling and with the various biases of his advisors, the critic Stanley Crouch and the trumpeter Wynton Marsalis, because they intentionally omit some key artists and moments, it is nevertheless a good sampler, and it's very useful in helping us trace the history of jazz in sound. Because the fact of the matter is that jazz and recorded sound are phenomena of the long 20th century. In other words, they appear as related modernist phenomena at approximately the same historical moment. For example, the very first acoustical recordings were made by Thomas Edison in the 1880s, which just actually predates the first recordings of jazz. The term itself is of argued definition, but one of the most likely definitions is that it was originally an adjective coming from an 1860s American slang expression meaning verve or energy. There is African American hot dance music before jazz, just as there's African American hot music before the recorded sound era. But jazz and recordings do come along at approximately the same moment, and therefore it's actually possible for us to more or less trace the history of jazz innovation through the history of recorded sound. It also seems appropriate to work this way because many jazz musicians, in addition to learning their trade on the bandstand or later on in universities, did and do a great deal of learning from recordings, going all the way back to 78 RPM records and continuing now in the 21st century with tools like YouTube and computer software. So what we'll do is trace the recorded history of some key moments in jazz history via 18 tracks I've selected for this Spotify playlist. They're in chronological order, remember those timelines, in order to help you keep track of what style changes precede or follow others. Specific dates are not quite so important, except you will notice certain periods of 5 or 10 years when a number of innovations seem to cluster or to follow along from one another in relatively quick succession. That can be a product of internal stylistic shifts, often driven by individual players or groups, or of external factors having to do with culture, society, technology, politics, and so forth. I'll be referencing all those kinds of internal and external factors as we go. So let's begin. This first song, which was recorded in 1947 in Alabama, but which is in a style which is much older, in fact, it probably predates the Civil War, is a work song sung by a worker we know only by the name of BB called Old Alabama. Now, this approach to singing came from the West African and Caribbean practice of coordinating group work, like clearing brush or driving railroad ties, by singing together in a call and response fashion to coordinate the effort of the work. And so you'll hear the tools swing and strike as BB sings Old Alabama. This next piece is a spiritual. It was recorded in 1933 by A.D. Corbin and Ed Frierson, but again, it's in a style that's much older and probably actually predates the American Civil War. This is the second of a style which we think goes into the early blues of the very late 19th century and jazz of the same period. So from 1933, this is Set Down Servant. Here's another recording made in the 1950s, but in a style which is much older in its inspirations. It's what I'd call a kind of pre-blues style, sung by a man named Mississippi Fred McDowell. He's playing the guitar, what they called the Spanish guitar, because it's sat up on your lap in the conventional guitar style. The guitar has been tuned to an open chord, and he's fretting with the broken off neck of a wine bottle. And it gives it that sliding sound that lets him imitate the sound of the voice, follow his own voice, or do call and response with his voice by sliding between frets. This style, you'll also notice, doesn't really make much use of chord changes at all. In other words, it's a drone-based style. There's some influence from Hawaiian music recordings of the 1910s, oddly enough, but also of West African styles of singing and playing one-string fiddles. So this is Mississippi Fred McDowell in a very old style, recorded in 1959 during the blues revival, a song called Soon One Morning, or Death Comes Creeping in My Room. This next piece is a piece which is probably going to be familiar to all of you in the ragtime style, which became popular in the 1890s. Scott Joplin is the best known composer of piano ragtime, but we should remember that there was a wide variety of people who wrote in a ragtime style, and that ragtime was not played only at the piano. There were also ragtime orchestras using this kind of rhythmic language. This is a particularly interesting example of a recording in that it's actually a piano roll. It's not an acoustical recording at all, but the notes of the piece have been punched into a very long roll of newsprint, which can be inserted into a player piano and then played back almost in the fashion of a music box. And these piano rolls, they were called, were quite popular. And sometimes maybe you'll see them in films depicting the Old West, the player piano playing all by itself with the roll indicating the notes to be played. They were also popular export items, and in fact, they were heard in Europe before African-American musicians ever got there. That's how Scott Joplin's ragtime music and music of other ragtime composers was heard by people like Debussy and Stravinsky. Now, Debussy and Stravinsky both wrote pieces inspired by these ragtime rolls, which they called jazz or ragtime. It's not really good jazz. It's not really good ragtime. But the fact that Debussy and Stravinsky and other Parisian composers in the years just before the First World War chose to write in this style is a good reminder that they were extremely interested in a wide diversity of musical influences from outside of the Austro-Hungarian symphonic music orbit. So this is an example of a music that would have been quite influential in Europe, as well as having been quite popular in the USA. From 1902, a piano roll of Scott Joplin's The Entertainer. Here's a recording which is captured originally on cylinder and then was re-recorded in other versions on shellac records. The band is James Reese Europe's 369th Harlem Hellfighters Band. And that's a very interesting story there for which we don't have a huge amount of time. But suffice it to say, the James Reese Europe was an African-American band leader in New York City prior to the First World War who ran a black musicians union called the Clef Club. At this time, it was not permitted for musicians of color to join the American Federation of Musicians. And so black musicians, led by James Europe, got together and founded the Clef Club. And they were both a booking agency and a music union, but they also were an orchestra. And the Clef Club Orchestra, there were multiple versions of the Clef Club Orchestra playing all around the New York area. If you've read any of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Jazz Age novels like The Great Gatsby, this is the music that was often hired for parties in New York or New Jersey or Long Island where Gatsby is set. From 1919, this is actually a New Orleans tune arranged by Jim Europe called the Darktown Strutters Ball. And they're called the 369th Harlem Hellfighters because when the U.S. entered the First World War in 1917, a very large collection of musicians from Harlem actually all joined up to the 369th Army Regiment of the American Expeditionary Force, and they went to France as a regimental band. And they played in Paris, and they played some on the Western Front itself. And they're some of the first hot musicians, African-American musicians, who were heard in Europe. And some of the songs that they recorded actually reference the fact that they fought in the conflict, like a song called On Patrol in No Man's Land. But this is a New Orleans tune called the Darktown Strutters Ball, and I would call this a kind of hot music, just pre-jazz. There are certain key things that are about to happen in jazz, but they're not quite there in this recording. You'll hear that this music's rhythmic language and its formal structure is actually very reminiscent of ragtime. And so I would call this a kind of orchestrated ragtime. Hot music for dancing from James Reese Europe's 369th Harlem Hellfighters Band. It's a curious thing that some of the first true jazz recorded by ensembles coming from New Orleans was in fact not recorded by African American musicians, although they are the originators of jazz in New Orleans, but by a group of Italian Americans, also from New Orleans, called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band. Now, the ODJB has sometimes gotten a bad rap as people who were appropriating African American music, but it should be noted that these players, most notably Nick LaRocca, grew up playing this kind of hot music in New Orleans, and that there was lots of interracial collaboration between musicians of color and white musicians in New Orleans at this period. New Orleans is a very unusual and wonderful place in that respect. The tune is a kind of novelty song. We call it a kind of novelty song, the Livery Stable Blues. Livery Stable is a place where animals were housed, and you'll hear lots of sort of jokey animal imitations. But there are a couple of crucial things going on here that make this a kind of prototypical New Orleans jazz, whether played by the original Dixieland Jazz Band or their contemporaries, the New Orleans Rhythm Kings. The first has to do with the formal structure. It is the structure of a 12-bar blues, and you can count those 12 bars in 4/4 time. The second thing is the instrumentation, which is a rhythm section consisting of tuba or bass and drums and piano, and then a front line of cornet, clarinet, and trombone. And that's a kind of classic New Orleans jazz rhythm section plus front line. And each of the instruments has its own role to play, even in a jokey piece like this. The trombone plays chord tones, kind of outlining the chord progression. The left hand of the piano carries the bass, doubled by either the double bass, the bass fiddle, or more commonly by the tuba, which is borrowed from street bands. The clarinet plays obligato, and the cornet plays the lead line, the melody line. So although it's a bit of a joke, it is kind of setting the pattern for the style of New Orleans jazz, which was played by both black and white musicians in New Orleans, and then went elsewhere, notably to Chicago, in some of the recordings that we're going to hear coming up next. So from 1917, this is the Livery Stable Blues. Pay attention also to the rhythmic language and to what happens in terms of where the beat falls, the emphasis in this 4/4 time, and how the eighth notes are played. Because this is the moment, I would argue, when we begin to hear what we can now call jazz. This is a really great recording that doesn't get entered into the histories quite so often, but it is a wonderful piece of musical history played by one of the great musicians in the history of jazz, the stride pianist James P. Johnson. It's called stride piano because this was an unaccompanied piano style in which the left hand on the piano would play a kind of bass line, would play boom, tick, boom, tick, boom, tick, boom, tick, while the right hand was doing other things on top. It's not unlike ragtime in that respect, the left hand 2/4, the right hand playing various kinds of polyrhythms, but it's an improvisational style, and it's a style which was subsequently quite influential on various forms of ensemble music, of small group music especially. The other thing about this that's really crucial is that it is the original version composed by James P. Johnson of a song called the Charleston, which some of you, if you're a dance fan, you might know became a very popular dance style in the 1920s. And it's called after the Charleston because that was the town that James P. Johnson came from, Charleston, South Carolina. And in Charleston, as in various other cities around the pre-World War II South, it was not uncommon for children's homes and orphanages to teach young people, especially people of color, particular trades, to teach them how to make shoes or be carpenters, or to teach them how to be musicians. And so the Colored Waifs Home in Charleston actually had a band, and some of those musicians who learned to play as children at the Colored Waifs Home in Charleston and also in New Orleans continued to come into the history of jazz as well. So from 1923, this is James P. Johnson at the stride piano playing the Charleston. It's an interesting thing that although in the 1960s there was a kind of blues revival, the rediscovery of particularly country blues players, rural players, solo guitar players, mostly men who played guitar and sang, And they were rediscovered, and they were brought to perform at folk festivals at Newport and elsewhere in the North in the late 50s and early 1960s, and in turn became a tremendous influence upon the players of the so-called British invasion, the people who founded the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. Some of the first blues that actually got recorded, some of the first million-seller recordings of blues, were actually by women. The great Clara Smith, Mamie Smith, Mama Yancey, and the singer on this particular song, a woman named Bessie Smith, who died tragically young in a car accident, but who really defined what came to be called the classic blues style, which was of women singers, mostly with big, powerful, often contralto voices, who could be heard in tent shows and in nightclubs with very, very minimal sound reinforcement, singing over the accompaniment of a band who were often made up of jazz players. So it's blues singers and jazz players. They were immensely popular. They toured widely. They had their own shows. They would dress opulently. They were statuesque and really impressive kind of media stars of their age. You can also find wonderful clips of Bessie Smith singing in early sound films on YouTube, and it's well worth seeking out. She's a remarkable person who, as I say, died tragically young, but she really set a pattern for a way to think about being a blues singer, which went out of fashion in the 1960s, but which subsequent history has sort of recovered and celebrated. So from 1927, this is Backwater Blues by Bessie Smith. I mentioned that in jazz, rhythmic innovation, particularly an emphasis upon a 2 and 4, 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4, and what we would call a swing eighth note, da 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 da, that those are crucial moments in the evolution of jazz style and the concretization of jazz style, these rhythmic innovations of 2 and 4 time, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, dooga 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 dooga, and swing eighth notes. In addition, there's various aspects about instrumentation, to have a rhythm section plus horns at 2 or 3 horns in the front line. In addition, there's a very strong element of influence from the blues in terms of the 12-bar blues form, but also of blues singers. But it really isn't until the recordings of in the late 1920s of the cornet and trumpeter Louis Armstrong, who really gives us the idea of the bravura jazz soloist, the great jazz improviser, someone who could spontaneously compose melodic improvisations accompanied by a rhythm section, which were unique and beautiful and different every time, a kind of spontaneous composition. Armstrong was a phenomenal technician, as the brass people among you will know. He had an endless melodic imagination as an improviser. He was a charming and funny and approachable frontman. And he also is one of the first people to sing improvisations. He sang what came to be called scat singing, where he would sing syllables very much in the style of his trumpet improvisations. So you listen to his trumpet improvisations, you listen to his scat singing, and they're very reminiscent of one another. Tremendously inventive melodically, very, very sophisticated in terms of how he outlined chord changes. And this opening cadenza for West End blues absolutely changed the game for trumpet players. From 1928, this is Louis Armstrong. So far we've talked about an era in jazz, really from the first recordings and about the first 10, 11, 12 years of the recording of jazz, in which a number of ideas begin to come to the fore. The idea of a combo of a rhythm section plus horns. The idea of playing with a certain kind of rhythmic language of 2 and 4 emphasis and swung eighth notes. The idea of different instruments having different roles. The idea of the great singer. The idea of each instrument playing in a kind of idiomatic fashion, like in the stride piano. The idea of the great soloist. We haven't talked yet about the role of the composer. And the role of the composer is sometimes misunderstood, and sometimes composition and improvisation are imagined to be two different things, but I would argue that every jazz improviser is actually spontaneously composing ideas. They're not making things up out of nowhere. They are spontaneously selecting and combining elements the way you would in a conversation, and they're very eloquent often. But in the history of jazz, especially in the late 1920s, there are a couple of composers who come along. Sometimes they're actually a bit at odds with one another, who really bring forward the idea that a jazz recording, particularly a jazz recording on a 78 RPM record, can be a kind of through composed miniature tone poem. And I would argue that Duke Ellington and from Washington, D.C., and Jelly Roll Morton from New Orleans are two examples of the jazz composer who really bring into jazz the idea that it can be not just a tune, not just an improvisation, not just a bravura soloist, but an actual portrait in sound. This is a piece from 1927 called East St. Louis Todlow, which was recorded several times by Duke Ellington and has been recorded widely by others. And it's very much through composed. It uses a musical form, but it also is a portrait. It's a kind of tone poem. East St. Louis Todlow, the reference is to a man who Ellington claimed to have seen in St. Louis, a beggar, African-American man who was a street person, who had a limp. And so Ellington claimed that he had been inspired in the rhythm of this piece to imitate the sound, what he heard in sound of this man's pace. It's a style that came to be called in the 1920s jungle music, which is a pejorative term. Ellington and his band had a long-term residency in the late 20s at a place in Harlem called the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club had a wire that led directly to the NBC radio broadcast tower, which meant that Ellington's music could be heard live on radio on Saturday nights across America. And in 1930 and 31, when he went out on the road, that was going to be very important because it meant that there were audiences already familiar with his music, any place they'd heard this jungle music on radio. You'll also hear one of the first great Duke Ellington soloists, the trumpet cornet player Bubber Miley, who uses various kinds of plungers and mutes to create a very vocal style in this lead line. And Bubber Miley had learned to do that on the cornet and trumpet in gospel choirs in his growing up in the South. So from 1927, featuring Bubber Miley, this is Duke Ellington's through composed tone poem, East St. Louis Todlow. You'll notice when you look at the dates on these next few pieces that I'm going to play that there's a bit of a gap, a leap of a few years. There's a real explosion of creativity in the late 1920s with mostly New Orleans-based music. Subsequently exported to Chicago and Detroit and St. Louis, but it's mostly combo music. It's music for small ensembles. In the early and mid-1930s, this kind of music was beefed up and bands went out on the road to play on touring circuits. The large cities could support clubs like the Cotton Club in New York or the Roseland Ballroom in Boston, where a band could be in residence for 2 months or 4 months. But if you were not in one of those major cities and you had a jazz band, a dance band, it was probably necessary for you to go out on the road. And so they would do that. They would play strings of one-nighters in dance halls, traveling by bus. And you would ride on the bus and you would get to the club and you would set up and you would play a 4-hour dance gig and then you would break down and maybe you would go and sleep in the segregated part of town at a rooming house that would accept African-American musicians, or sometimes you had to get right back on the bus and head on to the next one-nighter gig. The bands got bigger. They developed a particular way of playing that was quintessentially danceable, a way of arranging as the bands got bigger, which sort of formalized the role so that instead of having a single brass, high brass, single low brass, single clarinet, cornet, trombone, clarinet, you began to have sections, and you'd have a section of 3 trumpets, a section of 2 trombones, a section of 3 or 4 or 5 saxophones. And the brass and reeds would play off of each other in sections in these orchestrated arrangements along with the accompaniment of the rhythm section. It was all about dancing. It was all about putting out a big, punchy, tightly composed, very, very danceable sound. And the sound came to be called territory bands because they played in the territories. They played in the Oklahoma territory and they played in West Texas. They toured out of places like Tulsa and Dallas and places in the sort of upper Midwest and far West on these strings of one-nighters. And it's where swing music came from. They were mostly black bands, although if you know the Western swing music of people like Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, they're basically the same kind of band, only they have fiddles in the front line. But it's very much the same kind of thing. Territory bands touring, playing these big punchy arrangements that are designed to get dancers on the dance floor. This is one of the great arrangers who also led a band, very influential arranger throughout the history of jazz, man by the name of Fletcher Henderson. And from 1935, this is a tune very simply titled Hotter Than Hell. One of the things that has happened throughout the history of African American and, in fact, other popular musics throughout the history of this nation, particularly in the recording era, and particularly in the case of African American dance musics, is what we would call appropriation. When musicians with a little more economic power or a little bit higher social status, or white musicians, would re-record versions of music originally originated by black musicians. And those cover versions would go on to sell more copies, even if we might listen to them and think of them as musically inferior. And so a number of white musicians in all eras of popular music in America made more money by selling better marketed recordings and sheet music of styles that were originated by black musicians. Sometimes the black musicians were part of that because they realized that their music could find a wider audience if it was played by a white band or a white artist. And that's the case with this piece called King Porter's Stomp, which is another piece by Fletcher Henderson. It was composed and arranged by Fletcher Henderson, who we just heard playing Hotter Than Hell. But this is a white band, the band of Benny Goodman, the clarinetist Benny Goodman. A very, very popular band, very, very popular. They were one of the groups that gave rise to the swing movement, the movement of hot dance music played by white bands, eventually by black bands as well, but particularly by white bands. And they were the soundtrack of the 1930s and indeed of the 1940s. So this is Benny Goodman's orchestra from 1935 playing a swing version of a Fletcher Henderson chart called King Porter's Stomp. I've mentioned that the audiences and the bands in the swing era were largely segregated. It was eventually the case that the bands began to integrate, and for all that he was a very difficult man, Benny Goodman gets a lot of credit for that because Goodman had an all-white orchestra, but he decided that he also wanted to have a combo, and that in that combo he really, really wanted to have a couple of really crucial African-American musicians, particularly the guitarist Charlie Christian, who was one of the first electric guitar soloists, who was a black man who came from Texas, and the pianist Teddy Wilson. And so the Benny Goodman quartet included both Teddy Wilson on the piano and Charlie Christian on the guitar, and he eventually brought them into his band. So fair play to Benny Goodman for integrating swing music in the late 30s. Also in the late 30s, some of these territory bands, the African-American territory bands particularly, began to be heard in some of the northern cities, particularly the Count Basie Orchestra, who came from Kansas City, which was a center for the touring bands, an incredible place for jazz innovation, a place a number of musicians came from, particularly the great Charlie Parker, the alto saxophonist, and Bill Basie, Count Basie himself. They had a residency in New York City in 1937 and 38. And the way that they had evolved of playing, the style of playing they had evolved on the road, on their strings of one-nighters, was endlessly creative and very danceable. And it was really very much based around musicians who knew one another and knew how to play together. So, for example, this song was actually improvised on the bandstand. This is a subsequent and rehearsed version. But Basie tells a wonderful story about the night that they improvised Jumpin' at the Woodside. They were playing along in one key, and Basie yelled out to the rhythm section that he was going to change to a different key, and they changed to a different key. And the rhythm section plays the piece, and then one section comes in, they figure out a riff, and they harmonize it, and the second time through the tune, that section plays it. And then another section comes up with a counter riff, and so on and on. So this is what would be called a head arrangement. Was never written down originally, was literally improvised by this big band on the bandstand and only subsequently recorded in a cleaned up version. So from 1938, this is the great Count Basie Orchestra with Jumpin' at the Woodside. As we'll discover, both the First World War and the Second World War and the Great Depression in between them had a profound impact on popular music in America, including on jazz. Particularly in the case of the Second World War, even before the U.S. entered the war in 1941, The production of heavy industry was ramping up as the U.S. from about 1938 onward was manufacturing all kinds of war munitions, tanks and trucks and ships and airplane, to be sent to England and France as they resisted the outset of the war in 1939, in September of 1939. It was a program called Lend-Lease. What that meant was that lots and lots and lots of people were able to get work, and that lots of people were actually working what was called the swing shift, because factories could be open 24 hours a day, 3 8-hour shifts. So people working from, say, midnight to 8 a.m., they were working a swing shift. They could get paid more money. They got paid overtime. But the U.S. government was quite concerned about limiting how much leisure time and how much things like rubber and petroleum got used for leisure purposes. This was all supposed to go. The idea was that these kinds of manufacture and indeed people's work hours should go toward the war effort, especially after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so the U.S. government enacted all kinds of restrictions and rationing so that it became harder to get tires, became harder to get gasoline. And so it was difficult for the swing bands who had toured by bus. It was difficult for them to tour. Some of them had to stop touring because they couldn't get tires and gasoline and related materials. Other musicians decided that they would enlist instead of being drafted, because if they enlisted, they could stay together and work as musicians in the armed forces instead of maybe having to go to the front. Many black musicians were not eligible for enlistment, and so they tended to be much less interested in going into the armed services. And so what happened is the big bands kind of drastically ramped down their touring, or they enlisted, the white bands enlisted en masse. And black musicians found themselves a little bit at a loose end, many of them in major U.S. cities, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and especially in New York City. And so in the early 1940s, especially during a period when there was a restriction on recording, because shellac itself was needed for the war effort, and there were various other reasons, these musicians got together in small nightclubs where there was no dancing allowed because there was a tax on dance floors. And they began to evolve this new music, which they came to call bebop. And it came to be called bebop because that name is sort of onomatopoeic. It just references bebop, a particular lick that shows up in a lot of these tunes. And they're basically a combo. They're piano, bass, and drums, a couple of horns in the front line, playing over the chord changes of popular songs like I Got Rhythm or Autumn Leaves or I'll Remember April, but writing new melodies, new unison melodies on top of those chord changes, because in this period, chord changes couldn't be copyright. Only melodies could be copyrighted. So if you needed a tune for a recording session, you could borrow the changes, borrow the chord changes of I Got Rhythm, write a new line, and that would be your composition, and you could copyright it, put it on your record. So this style of bebop was immensely ambitious, highly virtuosic. These players had all cut their teeth on the big bands and touring, so they had absolute chops of steel and great technical facility, and they were really chafing at the idea that they wanted to play a more expansive music with longer solos and more virtuoso opportunity than just playing for dancing. And as Thelonious Monk said, we're going to make a music that's so hard that those white boys can't steal it. And I wouldn't say that, and of course, there have been great white players of bebop, but the architects of it, people like Dizzy Gillespie and Bud Powell and Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, Max Roach and Charles Mingus, they were black. And from 1942, this is a quintessential bebop tune, Dizzy Gillespie's All Stars featuring the alto saxophonist Charlie Parker with a tune called Salt Peanuts. If there's time, it's a fun tune to drop in here. This is a piece from a little earlier, 1937, a great dance piece led by a band led by a drummer, a man named Chick Webb, who was a little person. He was a person of abbreviated stature and had some health problems, but a fantastic drummer and singer, and a tune called Harlem Congo. Jazz has always been a music whose innovations were driven in part by the curiosity of players about new musical ideas, new ideas for structuring improvisation, and it really, honestly, an ever-expanding capacity for technical virtuosity, just astonishing virtuosity. And so what we have here from 1950 is a recording of a piano trio featuring Bud Powell. That's a type of Bud Powell. He's playing an older tune, a tune from the 1930s, but he's playing it in piano trio format with piano, bass, and drums. And you'll notice that what Bud Powell has done is he's worked out a way that his left hand can be playing chord changes, very sparse chord changes, the way that he might accompany, might comp for a horn player. But his right hand, instead of just playing chords, his right hand is playing the improvisation that a horn player might play. So it's a very horn-like approach, these long streams of angular and very virtuosic improvised right-hand melodic statements. So from 1950, this is Get Happy by Bud Powell. By the mid-1950s, bebop had become the de rigueur, the de facto style that people played, and they played it at a very, very high level. And you can find bebop recordings throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, which are shockingly virtuosic, fast, high, tangled, harmonically dense, just remarkable music. But some players in this period, the early 1950s, were beginning to experience bebop as a little bit constrained, even though it was technically incredibly flashy and virtuosic. It tended to be 32-bar song forms or blues. It tended to be 2-5-1 progressions, moving at very high speed, harmonically dense. The sheer sort of athletic demands of playing improvisations over those chord changes at those tempos on these instruments was actually beginning to seem like a little bit of a box. And so players began to explore the idea that they might be able to re-inject some new ideas and some new language into jazz, particularly by looking at other and related dance musics and particularly other and related dance rhythms. And so in the 1950s, a style called hard bop kind of looks back to the earlier blues and gospel and rhythm and blues and even Latin Afro-Cuban influences, which had been on the periphery or the earlier roots of jazz. But they begin to build that back into the bebop language. And so the tempos become more flexible. The rhythmic grooves become more varied. There's more interest in sort of funky and down home and grooving and in the pocket playing. It's kind of related to the rhythm and blues that was just percolating up at the same time. It's still an improvisational music. It's still being played by people with very high technical facility, but hard bop sort of expands the rhythmic language again. So this is Horace Silver and the Jazz Messengers with a tune called Doodlin'. There's lots more that could be said about jazz in the other half century since its inception, but I'm going to finish up today's lecture with another kind of watershed composition from one of the great improvisers in the history of jazz, the tenor saxophonist John Coltrane. Now, John Coltrane came from Philadelphia. He had grown up playing bebop. He had those skills. He had also played gospel and blues music. He had this huge tenor saxophone sound, very magisterial sound, great technical facility. He was an obsessive practicer, so great virtuoso technique. A very restless musical intellect, always kind of looking forward and looking forward and looking forward, and a very spiritual man. And he had played on a Miles Davis quintet record called Kind of Blue, which explored the idea of improvising over modes instead of having chord changes that go ding, 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 very fast changing chord progressions. You might set up a very simple vamp, as on Kind of Blue, a tune called So What? And that becomes the basis for the improvisation. This is the first movement of a four-movement work that was two sides of an LP in 1964. The record is called A Love Supreme. Coltrane was a very spiritual man, and so he thought of this piece as the four movements of A Love Supreme as a kind of acknowledgement, as a kind of celebration of one's devotion to the deity and to the sacred. So from 1964, a man who subsequently, actually after his early death from liver cancer, sadly, was actually treated as a saint by a church in Los Angeles, and a very spiritual man who was immensely influential and inspirational for generations of players after him. This is the John Coltrane Quartet with Acknowledgement from A Love Supreme. So folks, that's a 60-year sprint through some examples of all the places that jazz began, from which it began, the idioms and the experiences and the historical moments that it brought together, where it went, some of the reasons why it went there, and how we can track that on record. In a subsequent lecture, we could talk about jazz since the 1960s and all the way up to the jazz rock fusion of the 1970s and the kind of recovery of bebop and classic jazz in the 1980s, and even the kind of repertory bands playing classic charts by groups from various eras in jazz history, all the way into the 1990s and into universities. But the thing to remember is that jazz happened as all musics happen. Jazz happened in the ways that it did, at the moments that it did, with the sounds and the people and the intentions that it did, because of circumstances, of history, of experience, and of human creativity. Sometimes the circumstances were extremely painful, very sad, very unjust. But at all times, jazz, like all musics, was a response by humans seeking in the very challenging, sometimes very sad, sometimes joyful experience of the phenomenal world of samsara to create beauty.